What Derek Harrington didn't know was that the $3.8 million lakefront property his family had owned for 2 generations was mortgaged through my trust company. He thought he was humiliating a retired hardware store owner from Sudbury. He thought my calloused hands and my second-hand blazer told the whole story. He was wrong. Let me take you back to the spring when my daughter called me from Toronto. My name is Gerald Okafor. I came to Canada from Nigeria in 1981, 23 years old, with a suitcase, $300, and a letter of admission to Laurentian University. My late wife, Patricia, God rest her soul, she came 2 years after me, on a student visa, and we built everything together from nothing. A hardware store first, then a small property management firm. Then, quietly, over 30 years, something much larger. My daughter Adaze, everyone calls her Ada, she grew up watching her mother and me work 16-hour days. She never complained. She became a civil engineer, one of the best in Ontario, her firm says. She is everything Patricia and I ever prayed for. When Ada called me that April and told me she had met someone, I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard since her mother was alive. She sounded light. She told me his name was Connor Harrington. She told me he was kind, that he made her laugh, that he was thoughtful and patient. She said she wanted me to meet him soon. I told her to bring him to Sudbury for the May-long weekend. I would make jollof rice, and we would sit on the back deck and watch the lake. Simple. That is how Patricia and I always got to know people around a table, with food, without pretense. Ada arrived Friday evening. Connor was with her. He was tall, good-looking, well-dressed. He shook my hand firmly and called me sir. I thought, this is a good start. We ate. We talked. He asked me questions about Nigeria, about how I built the business, and he seemed genuinely curious. I liked him that first evening. I went to bed thinking my daughter had chosen well. It was the next day, Saturday, when his family arrived, that everything changed. The Harringtons drove up in 2 vehicles, a black Range Rover and a silver Mercedes SUV. Connor's father, Derek, stepped out first. He was a broad man, mid-60s, the kind of man who had never once in his life been told no. His wife, Sylvia, followed, immaculate, in a white linen jacket. Then Connor's older brother, Bradley, and his wife. They stood in my driveway and looked at my house the way people look at something that disappoints them. Derek shook my hand without looking at me directly. He looked at my house instead. Cozy place, he said. That was the first word he spoke to me. Cozy. I told him to come inside. I had prepared food, set out chairs on the deck overlooking the lake. Patricia had always said that a generous table could soften any room. I held on to that belief all afternoon. Over lunch, Derek asked me what I did for work. I told him I was semi-retired, that I had run a property management firm for many years. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not really listening. Property management, he repeated. So, like rentals, maintenance calls, that sort of thing? I said yes, among other things. He nodded again and turned to talk to his son. Sylvia asked Ada politely where she had gone to school. When Ada said civil engineering at U of T, Sylvia smiled tightly and said, "That must have been a lot of work for you." I noticed she did not say that to Connor, who had gone to Western for business, only to Ada. Bradley barely spoke to me at all. He spent most of lunch on his phone. After the dishes were cleared, Derek leaned back in his chair and said he wanted to have a frank conversation about the wedding. Ada and Connor had been together 14 months. They were not yet engaged. This surprised me that this man wanted to discuss a wedding before his son had even proposed. I said I was happy to listen. Derek said that the Harringtons had a way of doing things, that when Connor married, there would be a proper wedding, 300 guests. The Fairmont Royal York in Toronto. The full production. He said this matter-of-factly, the way people describe facts of nature, like weather. Then he looked at me and said that a wedding like that cost real money. He said the number out loud. $120,000. He said that in his family, both sides contributed equally. He looked at me and waited. I asked him to clarify what he meant by equally. He said $60,000. From my side, to be confirmed before any engagement took place. The deck was quiet for a moment. I could hear the lake. Ada's face had gone very still. Connor looked at the table. He did not correct his father. He did not say a word. I looked at Derek Harrington and I thought about Patricia. I thought about what she would have said. She would have been furious, quietly, the way she always was, a controlled, dignified fury that was more frightening than any shouting. I decided to be my wife's husband in that moment. I said calmly that I appreciated him being direct. Then I asked Connor directly, looking at him whether this was his expectation as well. Connor glanced at his father. Then he said, "I mean, it's how things are done in our family, Gerald." He called me Gerald. Not sir. Not Mr. Okafor. Gerald. Ada stood up from the table and walked inside. I heard the screen door close behind her. Derek seemed unbothered. He said he understood this might feel like a lot, given my situation. He said the word situation the way people use it when they mean limitation. I asked him what he meant by my situation. He said, "Well, you've done well for yourself, obviously. But this is Toronto. The Harrington name carries weight in this city. Connor's connections alone will open doors for Ada that..." I stopped him there. I said, "My daughter's name opens its own doors." Derek smiled. The kind of smile that is not a smile. He said he hoped we could be adults about this and find a workable number. I said I would think about it. That night, after the Harringtons left, Ada came and sat with me on the deck. It was dark. The lake was black and still. She said, "Papa, I'm sorry." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said she didn't know it would go like that. She said Connor had told her his family was old school, but she hadn't understood what that meant. I asked her if she loved him. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she thought she had. I reached over and held her hand. I told her that Patricia used to say that you could tell a man's character not by how he treated you on good days, but by whether he stood up for you when it cost him something. Ada wiped her eyes. I said, "Let's see what Connor does next." Connor called me the following Tuesday. He apologized for the way the lunch had gone. He said his father could be overwhelming. He said he personally didn't care about the money. He said all the right things. Then he said, "But honestly, Gerald, even a smaller contribution would go a long way towards smoothing things over with my dad, like even 40,000. It doesn't have to be the full amount." I thanked him for calling. I said I would be in touch. What I did not tell Connor Harrington was that for the past 19 years, the trust company I quietly owned, GTO Capital, registered in Ontario, had been the senior lender on a significant portion of Muskoka and Northern Ontario real estate. We specialized in high-value residential and estate properties. We were not a retail bank. We were not on billboards. People in certain circles knew who we were. People like the Harringtons apparently did not. I called my operations director that Tuesday evening. I asked her to pull the file on a property in Muskoka registered under Harrington Family Holdings. She called me back in 40 minutes. The Harrington Cottage, 4 bedrooms, boathouse, 340 feet of waterfront on Lake Rosseau, carried a mortgage of $2.1 million through a subsidiary of GTO Capital. It had been refinanced 18 months earlier. The rate was favorable. Derek Harrington had signed personally. I set the file aside and did nothing with it. Not yet. I am not a man who acts from anger. 3 weeks passed. Connor called Ada twice. She answered once. He sent flowers to her office. He texted me a polite message saying he hoped we could move forward. Then, in late June, Ada told me that Connor had told her his father was becoming impatient. That Derek had told Connor the relationship was inadvisable if the families could not come to a financial understanding. Connor had relayed this to Ada, apparently, as something she should take seriously. Ada called me crying. That was the moment I decided. I called my lawyer, Robert Cheng, who has been with me for 22 years, and I told him what I needed. Robert is a careful man. He asked me twice if I was sure. I told him I was. The call to Derek Harrington happened on a Wednesday morning in July. I called him directly, on his mobile. He answered on the 3rd ring. Cheerful. Probably thinking I was calling to negotiate. I told him I had been thinking about our conversation in May. He said, good, and that he was glad I'd come around. I told him I wanted to be as straightforward with him as he had been with me. I told him that GTO Capital held the mortgage on his Lake Rosseau property. I told him I was aware that the renewal was coming up in November. I told him, calmly and without any particular emotion, that in light of recent events, I would be reviewing whether to offer renewal terms. There was silence on the line. I told him that I had also taken the liberty of reviewing the terms of his current mortgage agreement, specifically the conduct clause, which he had signed. I told him that a senior lender has certain discretions when a borrower engages in conduct including financial intimidation directed at a third party that the lender deems inconsistent with the agreement. He said, "What are you talking about? Who is this?" I told him my full name, Gerald Okafor. I told him I was the principal of GTO Capital. I told him that the man he had called a hardware store owner from Sudbury had been his family's mortgage holder for the last 19 months. The silence this time was longer. He said this was outrageous. He said I had no grounds. He said his lawyers would. I told him, respectfully, that his lawyers were welcome to review the agreement. I told him I had already had mine do so. I told him I had no interest in his property. I had no interest in causing his family hardship. What I was interested in was something much simpler. I told him I wanted a phone call from his son, made freely and without pressure, ending his relationship with my daughter with a full and honest explanation of why. I wanted Ada to hear the truth from Connor directly, that he had been willing to reduce her to a transaction, and that this was not a family she needed to marry into. I told Derek that if that call happened before the end of the week, I would proceed with the renewal in November at standard terms, and we would never speak again. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You can't be serious." I told him I had never been more serious in my 63 years. Connor called Ada that Friday afternoon. Ada told me about it afterward. She said he was quiet on the phone, subdued in a way she had never heard before. He told her that he had not stood up for her the way he should have. He told her his family's values were not values he was proud of. He told her he was sorry, genuinely, and that she deserved someone who would put her first, without being asked. Ada said it was the most honest conversation she had ever had with him. She also said she felt, for the first time in weeks, that she could breathe. She asked me later if I had done something. I told her that I had simply introduced myself properly to the Harrington family. She laughed. The first real laugh I had heard from her in 2 months. She said, "Papa, what does that mean?" I said it meant that sometimes people need to understand who they are actually speaking to before a real conversation can happen. In November, GTO Capital offered the Harrington mortgage renewal at standard market terms, as I had said we would. We are a business, not a vendetta. Derek Harrington signed without comment. I was told by Robert that he had aged noticeably. I did not take satisfaction in that. Truly, I did not. I took satisfaction only in what came after. What came after was this. Ada spent that autumn the way I had not seen her spend time since she was a teenager. She hiked with her friends in Algonquin. She took a weekend course in watercolor painting that Patricia had always wanted to take and never had the time. She called me every Sunday evening and we talked for an hour, sometimes 2. In the spring, she met a man named James at a fundraiser for the Sudbury Food Bank. He was a physician. Quiet, funny, the kind of man who carries chairs for other people without thinking about it. He drove up to meet me in June. He brought a bottle of Ontario ice wine and a container of chin-chin his mother had made, because Ada had told him I was Nigerian, and he had asked his Nigerian colleague what to bring. I liked him immediately. Over dinner, he asked me how I had built my business. He listened to the whole answer. He did not look at his phone. He asked follow-up questions. After he left, Ada came and stood beside me at the kitchen sink, where I was washing up. She said, "Well?" I said, "Your mother would have loved him." Ada put her head on my shoulder. I kept washing the dishes. The lake outside was silver in the last of the evening light. The same lake Patricia and I had looked at for 31 years. The same one that had been there when I had nothing, and was still there now. I thought about what Derek Harrington had seen when he pulled into my driveway that May afternoon. A cozy place. A retired man with calloused hands and a second-hand blazer. A transaction he thought he could manage. I thought about what Patricia used to say. Near the end, when things had gotten large and complicated and sometimes frightening, we didn't build all of this for the money. We built it so that when it mattered, we would be able to choose, so that no one could ever make us feel small and have it be true. I dried my hands on the dish towel and went to join my daughter on the deck. Some things do not need to be said out loud. The lake was enough. The evening was enough. Ada was happy. That was and had always been the only thing that mattered.